Hello world, today we'll be talking about Machinarium.
Machinarium is a point-and-click, narrative-based adventure game released in 2009 by the Czech video game company Machinarium Design. It features logic puzzles, steampunk-inspired visuals, and an original soundtrack.
You play as the robot Josef, journeying through the city to stop some bad guys, help the king, and save your robot girlfriend, Berta. On the way, you meet a range of mechanized city dwellers, including prisoners, maintenance workers, musicians, a few pet creature things, and some policemen.
It's clear from the start that Amanita had class commentary in mind, looking at Yosef's hike from the dreary underground areas of the city to the upper levels near the king, and the use of steampunk aesthetics, which brings in stereotypes of repressive class structure in Victorian society. Actually, let's take a closer look at that. Like most stereotypes, it overgeneralizes, but it's founded in reality. Professor Catherine Hughes explains that as a result of the Industrial Revolution, occupation was increasingly important to social class. She cites a 19th century political cartoon titled The British Beehive, which portrays a hierarchy with royalty at the top, followed by lawyers, doctors, educators, mechanics, merchants, artisans, and finally manual laborers. Hughes writes of how this occupation-based system, in contrast to the hereditary lottery of the past, fostered new ideas of upward mobility and self-help, which proclaimed that hard work begets success and regarded the poor as, quote, lazy and responsible for their own misfortune. In addition, people who managed to rise up in society were ever more concerned with keeping up appearances so that they could fit in with their new class. So as mobility increased, so did class distinctions and obsessive adherence to expectations. The creators of Machinarium produced a fictional world that satirizes these Victorian notions of class ranks and human interaction.
As the player advances through the game, they find themselves continually scaling the city and its social ladder. More specifically, the higher class characters are found at the higher elevations of the city, while the lower class characters are confined to the lower limits of the city. The dichotomy between the classes, based solely off possessions, is prevalent throughout the game. We see in the first stage a robot wasting away in a scrapyard, whereas up in the King's Tower, the interior is complete with carpet, taxidermied robots, and a fountain. The producers further developed this mapping of Victorian thought onto Machinarium by incorporating other common class distinctions into its gameplay and plot. Amanita Design utilizes the affordances of video games to suggest that classes can be differentiated by levels of intelligence. As you can see here, the first puzzle in the game entails problem solving akin to I Spy, with the player only needing to select the appropriate elements to progress. However, by the end of the game, as Josef is interacting with higher classed individuals, the player is completing far more complex tasks. Further, the robotic characters in the game exemplify class in the Victorian era. David Cody, the Associate Professor of English at Hardwick College, defines social classes as the more or less distinct social groupings which constituted British society, and enumerates working, middle, upper, and under classes. All of these classes appear in Machinarium at various points in the game, and many of them further require the player to interact with them to progress. In fact, new classes and professions are introduced in nearly every section of the game, revealing an intent to satirize the Victorian class structure by exaggerating the prevalence of and dichotomy between classes during the Victorian era.
While the classes within Machinarium are evidently displayed throughout Josef's journey, the seemingly ordered structure is starkly juxtaposed by the chaotic and arbitrary actions of each class. The Black Cat Brotherhood, a criminal organization and the main antagonists of the game, are never given any clear motive for their petty crimes and ludicrous bomb plot. The police force and king act as mere figureheads, inept and idle, despite the clear danger present for those in their care. Furthermore, the representation of lower-class robots is entirely superficial, as Josef never encounters the massive factories and crowded slums widespread in an industrialized Victorian city. The city is devoid of even the typical disparity in education or literacy between classes, as all characters communicate with images rather than words. This irony between superficial class distinctions and actual social chaos is reinforced by the steampunk aesthetic of the game. Machinery-based visuals, hand-drawn backdrops, dingy color scheme, and an atmospheric soundtrack work together to build an undeniably steampunk experience. In an article titled "Steampunk as Design Fiction," PhD students at Simon Fraser University note that, quote, At the heart of steampunk is its celebration of individual liberty, egalitarianism, and gender equality, even as it draws inspiration from a historical era in which an oppressive class system still dominates society." End quote. Steampunk is defined by its contradictory origin and purpose. It draws from its basis in Victorian England's institutionalized class structure to highlight egalitarianism and individual strength. The glaring presence of steampunk in Machinarium reinforces the designer's commentary on strong classes whose effectual purpose remains non-existent.
While the other robots seem to fit into these superficial class labels, Joseph does not. His flexible body allows him to literally transcend the static roles of his fellow robots by seamlessly traveling between different levels with a simple click. He associates with all classes and adopts many different roles. We are informed that Joseph is friendly with the Robot King, possibly hinting to a higher status, but his journey starts at the bottom of the city, in a junkyard. It's impossible to characterize Joseph with some class or single quality like we can other characters. Joseph does not fit into the decrepit old man who needs aid, or the sulky, smoking prisoner archetypes that we meet along his journey. Even as a protagonist, Joseph is not some perfect hero in a world out to get him. Instead, he resembles a more Dark Knight-like character, willing to steal from and hurt other characters in order to rescue his girlfriend, Berta. According to Jay Bolter and Richard Grusin in Remediation, Understanding New Media, while television remotes offer a small degree of control to viewers, games offer far greater user interactivity. Given the affordances of a video game over those of standard media, players have a more meaningful and immersive experience. When players take on the role of Joseph, they themselves defy the class structure of Machinarium. They can personally recognize the superficiality of social classes, proving for themselves a central argument of the game. Through the intricate design of class elevations in the city, the lack of role fulfillment by the robot citizens, and Joseph's ability to transcend the city's class structure, we see that Amanita design communicates a satirical perspective on the superficial restrictedness of Victorian culture and class structure.
However, this entire time we have analyzed Machinarium with the assumption that the creator's primary incentive was to convey an argument on class, but a different perspective arises if we consider that the game designers were actually focused on producing a marketable game and not on social commentary.
Then, by applying the assertions of Simon Joyce, a professor at the College of William and Mary, we see that the producers unintentionally provide a demonstration of modern ideology rather than Victorian ideology by examining the era through the rearview mirror of a century and a half of human history. This understanding leads us to recognize the value that we place on egalitarianism and social mobility as hallmarks of a successful society.
In this case, Joseph can no longer be seen as a subversive robo-rebel of the Victorian hierarchy, but rather a modern protagonist embedded into a marketable steampunk setting.